Afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm now on mute. Yeah, sorry, mastering technology already. Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Neil Mackenzie, the Director of Competition and Consumer Policy in BEIS, starting this session as the Age Champion. In a short minute, we'll get underway, but I'll just leave it for another 60 seconds or so for those who are not as prompt as you are at arriving, so we get everyone ready to roll. Despite being in lockdown for a year, it is still quite odd to be not able to see everyone. But I hope you're also going to have lots of questions, and please put them in the chat. You'll see Jane Lovell has already put a few in, but please feel free to add. And after Anna has given her presentation, there'll be plenty of time for questions. Right, my PC has turned to 15:01, so let's get underway. So thank you all for coming, and thank in particular to Anna Dixon, who's the Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing. I won't try and summarise Anna's role and what the Centre does. I will leave that to her. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Anna, and if she could also introduce her colleague Patrick, who will be helping out with the Q&A at the end. But over to you, Anna.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. So yes, as Neil said, I'm Anna Dixon. I'm Chief Executive of the Centre for Ageing Better. We are a charitable foundation and also a What Works Centre, and we focus on creating a society in which everyone enjoys later life. And we use evidence to try and change both policy but also practice, and we work with partners across England. So I've been, well, the organisation's been going for 5 years, and we during that time have learned loads and done loads, and I just want to share a little bit of that with you today, with a particular focus on our work on employment. I'm joined today by my colleague Patrick Thompson. He's our Senior Programme Manager and leads our work on age-friendly employment. And so he's going to be around for the Q&A. And I'd just like to acknowledge he leads and has done a lot of the work that I'm going to be using in my presentation today. So thanks very much. So without further ado, I will get going with the slides and my presentation. Do please, as I'm going through, post your questions, as Neil said, in the Q&A. Really looking forward to hearing what sparks your interest. So the title for today's talk is around making the workforce more age diverse. And I posed myself the question, what will it take? But I hope that's a question that you'll be asking yourselves, and that you'll take away some ideas for action from today's presentation. So just to sort of put in context, why on earth an organisation that's interested in a good later life would be focusing on employment? Well, one of the things we know is that matters to people in later life is financial security, but also having social connections and meaning and purpose and good health. And at the Centre for Ageing Better, we decided we wanted to take a sort of more preventative approach to try and intervene when people are approaching later life, so in their 50s and 60s. And obviously one of the key factors in whether people are going to be financially secure in later life is whether they're able to stay in work up to and potentially beyond state pension age. So this nice diagram is really intended to show, though, that there are lots of intersections between these things. We know that particularly for older workers, actually, work is a source of social connection. And actually, when they retire, one of the things they miss most about work is that social interaction. We also know there's a really critical intersection with health. One of the main reasons that people fall out of work in their 50s and 60s is because of a health condition. So what is the pattern? This is data on the employment rates for men and women from 50 on, and you can see that from sort of mid-50s onwards, there's quite a steep decline in employment rates for both men and women. So that by the time you get to state pension age, less than half are actually in work at that point. So there is quite a significant economic activity gap. Some obviously part of this is voluntary. You know, there are still people, lucky people, who have generous pensions and perhaps can afford to retire early. But unfortunately, for many people, this is not voluntary, and reasons may be health, caring responsibilities, or indeed redundancy. And obviously, this was pre-COVID. Research that we commissioned from the Learning and Work Institute has really shown the number of older workers who have been impacted by the lockdown. We have heard a lot, I think, both in policy and in the news about the impact on younger workers, but there has also been a significant impact on older workers. And one of the things that we worry about is that we look back at past recessions and we see that older workers are some of the least likely to ever get back into work. So a real concern for us at the moment, and I hope a concern for those of you who are working in perhaps policy areas related to employment, to be thinking about making sure that some of the stimulus, some of the programmes that the Chancellor has been announcing, not only today but sort of previously, to support people back into work actually benefits people 50 plus as well. We did some joint work with Ipsos Mori during the lockdown to try and understand the impact on 50 to 70-year-olds. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there was a lack of confidence, particularly this is amongst those who were currently unemployed, that they were not confident they would find employment in the future. So people really feeling quite pessimistic about their employment opportunities, and perhaps at the moment rightly so, but clearly we do want this situation to change and the right support to be there, tailored support for people over 50 to help them get back into work. So in that same research on learning from Learning and Work Institute, we also were trying to understand what challenges older workers say they would face in returning to work. And clearly skills gaps is an issue for people. So sectors that they may have been working in for 30 years, not expecting jobs to return in those sectors, and where the growth sectors are, perhaps not feeling that they have the right skills to be able to apply for those. So there's definitely a need for them to develop new skills to transition to new sectors. But we also heard that there were issues around finding flexible work. So for people in this age group, flexibility is really the #1 issue, as I'll come on and talk more about in a moment. They also felt that there were stereotypes, both bias on the point of the employers, but I guess also they may feed into their own internalised ageism in terms of their confidence and aspirations. So quite a lot to be addressed here. And I think it's just really important to think about the sorts of jobs that people can sustain through to and beyond state pension age. So I think this is quite a significant minority. 1 in 4 workers in the UK think that they wouldn't be able to do their job by the time they're 60. So this is obviously a concern, and either the jobs need to change, we need to redesign roles, or people themselves need to change. And one of those perhaps is that they need to be supported to stay in better health so that that doesn't impact on their ability to work. So given all this, the Centre for Ageing Better has been working now for a number of years, led by Patrick, to develop this concept of age-friendly employer and to look at what the evidence is, both to support why an employer might want to become more age diverse and age-friendly, the evidence about what they should do, and then trying to turn that into really practical tools for employers. So we've seen the civil service has already taken a really strong leadership role around this, and BEIS in particular, and it's great that we've got Neil chairing today's session, who's the age champion. But we really feel that there's a lot more that not only the civil service could be doing, but other employers to really support people to stay in work for longer. So perhaps some of you work in HR or in that part of the civil service. So thinking about who is this older workforce? Well, it's actually quite a lot of your workforce. Already today, 1 in 3 workers are age 50 and over, and the average employee is in their 40s. And pre-COVID, we were very much making the argument that people needed to be retaining older workers because of skill shortages and workforce planning. And in some areas, that is still the case. Obviously, with Brexit and with COVID, it's really changed the labour market beyond recognition in a very short space of time. And yet there are vacancies in sectors like the NHS, in care. And so there is still an issue about trying to retain and attract older workers into some of these sectors. And why is this? Well, because of the demographics. There simply aren't enough younger workers coming into the labour market to replace the numbers of older workers who are leaving. And so we've got this sort of very rapidly changing profile with 300,000 fewer workers under 30 and 1 million more over 50. So we're basically giving the message that everybody needs to pay attention to this, because regardless of the impact of lockdown, you do have an age diverse and an ageing workforce. And we hope to sort of get across a positive message that age diversity can be seen as an opportunity. So having that age diversity within your workforce, there's older workers can transfer vital knowledge and skills to younger workers, help solve complex problems, and depending on the service profile of your service users or customers. So if you were working in job centre or in some businesses, there are definitely a lot of older consumers. So thinking about the age diversity of the workforce can often be beneficial in terms of understanding your customers. And recently the OECD have published analysis showing that multi-generational teams can be productive and that there are some sort of positive productivity effects of having age diversity in teams, things like lower job turnover, greater management experience, and generally more work experience. So there are sort of emerging evidence that there are some productivity benefits of having age diverse teams. I mentioned that we'd looked at the evidence of what actions should be taken, and these 5 have come through as the top actions: being flexible, hiring age positively, ensuring everyone has health support, encouraging career development at all ages, and creating this age positive culture that I just talked about. I'm going to just focus very briefly on 2 of these, flexibility and hiring age positively, where we've done some practical work with employers that we can share with you. So flexibility is the #1 thing that you can do to support people to work longer. And there's different types of flexibility, but it can include part-time, or it could involve some redesign of the role. But these are important things to help people work longer. And we worked with TimeWise to develop a flexible working toolkit to really make it very clear and simple for line managers and employers to understand that if they want to make flexible working more available to older employees, these are some of the things that they can do. I'm not going to go through all of this, it's all available on our website, and if you have questions about it, then Patrick will be able to talk more in a moment. The second area that I just want to touch on is around eliminating age bias in the recruitment process, and I think this has become even more important, obviously, with the changes in the labour market, because some of those older workers who will come off furlough and who may become redundant, the key to whether they're going to get back is not only the employment support or the retraining support that I mentioned, but is also whether they continue to face barriers from employers, from recruiters in terms of the employment and recruitment process. And sadly, there are views amongst employers and recruiters that are going to make this more difficult. Firstly, they don't even see age diversity as a problem. So even though there is evidence that there are negative perceptions of older applicants, this is not something that employers and recruiters are focusing on. It's not seen as a major feature of diversity and inclusion. So although age is a protected characteristic, it's often not considered. And some of the practices which are not good for inclusion more generally do disadvantage older workers, things like do you fit, particularly if it's already a fairly young profile to the workforce. And often there's a much more focus on how do we get some more young people, young workers into our organisation. So lots of schemes about hiring, young talent and nurturing young talent, but very little about a focus on recruiting experience in older workers. So some issues there that obviously need to be addressed on the employer and recruiter side. We've recently just published Older Workers' Perceptions of Ageism, and clearly they are citing examples of experiencing disadvantage, feeling that they are stereotyped, this concept of too much experience, which we took as the title of the report, but also other things around thinking that they're going to be less physically or mentally able, less committed, this idea, well, how long are you going to stick around, these sorts of attitudes. So throughout the recruitment process, people experiencing ageism and age discrimination, which can then feed people's sort of loss of confidence and loss of identity, further fueling them to perhaps opt out of seeking work. So quite concerning pattern, particularly as we obviously are coming out of the lockdown. So really would encourage you, if you're in a position to, within the department or within even just your team, to be thinking about how you might do a better job of adopting some of these age-friendly employer actions. They are things that are going to probably benefit a wide range of people, but some of how they're offered and whether they're seen to be things that are available to older workers, I think, is part of the challenge here, particularly around flexibility and also health support, where we know that for older workers sometimes there's a slow onset of decline in their health, and if they're not supported, they might not self-identify as needing workplace adjustments to prompt that conversation with their line manager. And we also know that often there's a little bit of a reticence in terms of career development, assumptions being made about when people might be retiring, and therefore is it worth investing, or whether they are ambitious to continue to progress. So really important that we just challenge some of these unconscious biases within ourselves and within our teams to address these things. Obviously, we also look to policy to change, and it's been great working with some colleagues on the policy side around the employment bill, and we might pick that up a bit more in our conversation about, do we need to make certain things a little more mandatory around being able to, that flexibility should be available from date of hire. If you have a caring responsibility, that doesn't kick in after several weeks of a job. You need to know before you even take the job whether they will be able to offer that flexibility from day one. So we think that advertising all roles as flexible, but then this requirement that that flexibility should be available from day one of hire. Also things around, carers leave, rights to carers leave, and potentially rights to paid carers leave would make a huge difference to the ability of older workers who are caring for either partners or older relatives to be able to continue to manage work and caring. So there are some policy changes that we think would be beneficial. We obviously talk a lot to DWP colleagues about policies around employment support, as I mentioned, for older workers, and trying to make sure that the same focus is given to over 50s as it is to younger people, to make sure that they're getting the right tailored employment support. If you're interested more generally in some of the things that Centre for Ageing Better works on and some of the evidence, you might be interested in this book that I published, The Age of Aging Better, a manifesto for our future. It really tries to knock on the head some of the negative myths about the age shift and how sort of bad it is, and really say if we got our act together and did things differently today, we could actually create the age of aging better and see the age shift as a sort of force for good rather than the challenge that it's so often seen to be. So very much looking forward to discussing some of these themes more, and I do hope that you've been inspired to think perhaps and challenge yourself to consider, you know, how age diverse is your team that you're part of, that you manage, and whether there's any more that you could be doing to create this sort of age-friendly employer and age-diverse workforce. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Anna. There's already quite a few questions in the chat, so I would encourage people to add more. One of the popular questions is, can we have a copy of the slides to share with everyone? So I hope that's okay. One of the, I'll use Chair's privilege to ask a very open question for you and Patrick. In BAYS, and I'm conscious there are some non-BAYS people in the audience, but certainly in BAYS, we've got strong circumstantial evidence of age bias in recruitment and promotion, well, mainly in promotion, from work we've done over the years as to who's got promoted. It's hard to see that there is actual bias, or whether it's in the processes, or whether it's a kind of more a reflection of wider societal prejudices, just the way colleagues speak about we need someone, a younger member of the team to do this special piece of work quickly, you know, just kind of lazy thinking. What are your top tips for creating that age positive culture and just getting people to not slip into lazy thought processes, which sometimes can be ageist? Yeah,
I mean, maybe I can start, and then Patrick can pick up. I think, you know, you've started with the right thing, which is look at the data. So most organisations aren't even looking at their data by age. And if you're not looking at it, you don't even know whether you've got a problem or not. So obviously, the civil service are ahead in terms of transparency and analysing the data you have to even be able to identify that there might be an issue. So I think that's really a great starting point, and we would urge all employers to make sure that they are analysing their data by age. But then I think you've sometimes got to dig beneath the data, and sometimes that's just about talking to people about their actual experiences. So what are people's experiences of working within the civil service, and, you know, whether they are not putting themselves forward for promotion, and if so, why not? Or if they have put themselves forward for promotion, you know, what are the sort of unconscious biases, or potentially even some explicit criteria that may be inadvertently discriminating on the basis of age, even if they're not intended to do that. So I think in some ways it's really about having then those, once you've got the data, those open conversations to really understand, you know, why and what's happening, and that starts to be the basis on which you can obviously develop some solutions. But Patrick may have some further insights to add.
Yes, and I'd certainly agree with all of that Anna said, and perhaps maybe only other thing to add on the data piece, because I think, no, you're right. It's very difficult to unpick how much of this is age bias or ageism, and how much is just where people have reached in their careers, and then therefore you might expect people to do less well at progression and so on. But one thing you could do is try and look at both their age, but also their length of tenure. So is it that someone has been there a long time and has been in that role a long time, they might be discriminated because of that, as opposed to just their age as well. So that could be one way of slightly disaggregating that as well. And then I suppose you also asked, what are some employers doing? We've got, you know, to promote age positive cultures within the full guidance that we can certainly share after this. We've got a number of case studies there, and it's not to endorse any one of these organisations, but some organisations have done some really interesting things. So, for instance, one organisation had an intergenerational board game, which they had a sort of operational teams that worked together, people of different ages, and actually this board game could, I mean, it sounds maybe a bit flippant, but it could really get people thinking about people's ages and lives from other perspectives and things like that. So yeah, some slightly thinking outside the box things that employers could be doing. And also maybe worth mentioning that, Anna, you also sit on a sort of DIALS diversity and inclusion group to sort of showcase age as a protected characteristic amongst many others as well. And actually just raising the awareness amongst employers through networks like that can also be very positive as well.
Great, thanks, Patrick and Anna. And another issue in the BEIS very much at the moment is trying to assess or convince some of the older workers that they shouldn't be satisfied with just resting on their laurels and should continue to progress if that's what they want and try new experiences. So we are trying to get case studies, and there are, again, pockets of good practice in terms of our apprentices. We started recruiting apprentices at 50 plus. We haven't quite excelled as well as DWP. I understand they've managed to get a 69-year-old apprentice there, so that's something we should be aiming for. But going back to questions in the chat, Jane, one of the questions Jane asked was about recruiting during the pandemic. Has it affected some age groups more than others, including some of the younger graduates and school leavers? How do you think we need to adapt, both BEIS but just employers generally, to develop age-inclusive recruitment post-COVID?
Well, this is where we've just done a lot of research, and we're about to embark on a sort of trial of how we can debias the recruitment process, given the insights, and Patrick could talk more about that. Clearly, as I say, it's absolutely critical that we get this right and we get it right quickly. There is something about acknowledging unconscious bias, and I think a lot of us are being challenged on diversity and inclusion in terms of race and some of the unconscious bias. But it's really important that we're naming some of the stereotypes and unconscious bias that we might have around age. So if you are a recruiting manager, I think, just really acknowledging that. But it's also about some of the language that we use. You talked there about sort of in progression terms, Neil. We're looking for somebody energetic, enthusiastic. Sometimes some of the language, and we've been looking at seeing whether some language does put older workers off, and we've got work coming out on that. But Patrick might wish to.
Yeah. I mean, just to add to that, yes, we've got a whole program work looking at this. We've got a new report coming out in a month or so, which is, we ran an experiment looking at different words used in job adverts to see which would be better or worse for different age groups. And actually, the first thing there is no silver bullet. It's just tweaking a few words won't make things perfect, but it can certainly help a little bit. And particularly talking about yourself as an inclusive and diverse organisation can help more people to click through to your jobs from different ages. And I think it's also about how you actually conduct the interviews themselves. I think in many ways the civil service is very transparent. They have a lot of processes there. So I think a lot of the messages we've got are really about the bulk of employers who are having unstructured interviews, don't have systematic processes in place that can increase bias as well. So we certainly share that as well. And I think just also how COVID has impacted all this, we've obviously also seen a rise in things like video interviewing, an increase in AI and algorithms in sifting CVs. Sometimes those can adversely impact older workers, but often it's really they're a tool that can be as good or bad as the people who use them. So I think it's just always checking through an age lens, is this disadvantaging someone as well? And I think if we look in a few years' time post-COVID, I think it's also thinking very carefully about how anyone reviewing a CV or an application thinks about gaps in CVs and work history. That's often taken as being a black mark or something that really needs to be explained. I think there will be sort of millions of people who have been, either through the furlough or other things, they will have very legitimate reasons for having gaps in CVs, and we've got to be thinking very carefully about how we respond to them when we hire in the future as well.
Thanks. There's a great question from Hugh in the chat, which I'm very tempted to give my own opinions, but I'll pass to Anna and Patrick, who are probably more objective and evidence-based. But he's pointing out that he's from Treasury, which has one of the youngest age profiles in the civil service, and he's asking whether there's any advice of how to get to grips with the data to understand what is driving the age profile. You know, he's suggesting it could be pay rates, where they recruit, how we frame jobs, and so on. Any key pointers?
Yeah, well, I think certainly the age profile of different departments in government can be driven by, you know, whether it's more policy oriented or more operational delivery focused, how London based it is. You know, you might skew it more towards younger workers. So I guess the announcement today that Treasury is moving north, or at least part of it, I think, is going to Darlington, you know, could really help. It would be a really great opportunity to get more diversity into Treasury. So I think, you know, there are a number of structural things that probably mean that it's, you know, it's maybe harder or different for Treasury than other departments like DWP, which obviously has a very large frontline workforce across the country in terms of job centres. So that may be a factor, but I think it's like any diversity and inclusion, it's about just looking at every stage. So where are you advertising? How are you advertising? How do people enter? So if most of the entry is fast stream and you're not really recruiting people to come in, either transferring from other sectors, or that there are sort of entry opportunities for people to restart their careers later on, that could be a factor. We know that if you are solely advertising, as I think Patrick was maybe mentioning, in terms of digital, that can be less likely to attract older workers. There may be things about, you know, whether you're offering flexibility, whether you're asking for some very particular requirements. If those job requirements are written, for example, some of the qualifications, if you're an older, you're much less likely to have done a master's or a PhD, because at the stage you went through, that was not as common as, you know, higher education in general was not as common as it is now. So all of these factors, it could be quite a lot of things to unpick. The main thing is that you start to look at the age of applicants, how many are getting through a sift, how many are then being interviewed, how many get through the interview process. So, you know, it's the same with any diversity. It's doing that monitoring across the recruitment process and really trying to understand, you know, is it that you're not getting people in, or are they coming in and going out quickly and you're only keeping the younger workers? So it could be a number of dynamics. The main thing is, yeah, again, look at your data and try and see where the issue is.
Thanks, Anna. And yes, I do think, sorry, Patrick, do you want to come in?
No, I think all spot on. Yeah, 100% agree with all that. I think that's covered it all. Great,
thanks. Yeah, I agree. The moving north of the civil service should help in a lot of ways, and it certainly seems to be an appetite to do it properly this time. I'm afraid I've been in the civil service long enough to see repeated attempts at this, but actually putting a lot of senior people and creating a career structure outside London is going to make a big difference, I think. Although we were discussing in my own management team yesterday that meeting some of our targets for ethnic minority staff might be harder in outside London, in some parts that certainly BASE is looking at locating some of its operations in Manchester. We thought we'd probably have a better pool of diverse candidates in London, but we'll see how that pans out. Other questions in the chat. Jane again has asked a good question on intersectionality in terms of whether there are any particular other characteristics which age is most closely linked to in employment, or those who do less well in employment that we need to be focused on.
Does Patrick maybe want to start this time?
Sure. Yes. I mean, age is it's a really interesting characteristic in as far as it does interact with everything else. It is one of those ones that, you know, we are all aging throughout our working lives, and there are things that affect you differently as a younger person, as an older person. Age bias is actually the most commonly experienced form of bias in the workplace because it happens to everyone, but it does particularly intersect with others. So, I mean, most obviously through some of the work we've done around the interaction between age and gender and how that impacts in the workplace as well. So, I mean, fantastic there is now a strong movement and requirement to have gender pay gap reporting. But if employers were to look in more detail at the age breakdown of the gender pay gap, that would offer them something really interesting as well, because across the economy the gap is widest for older women in particular. And that's not even to say in terms of looking at the pension gap as well, which is even wider than the pay gap. So things around gender and aging as well, and also how that impacts on working and caring as well. We know that the world and the workplace is nowhere near equal enough in terms of caring. You're far more likely to be a carer if you are older and a woman in the workplace, and you're also more likely to be working caring for longer hours as well, which then goes on to impact your employment as well. If you look at the intersections with things particularly around disability as well, we know that poor health isn't inevitable as you age, but it does become more likely. So thinking about how age and disability and sex is really key as well. But I suppose it's just, yeah, it does interact with everything, and I think it's one of those ones that we as an organisation probably have to unearth and think more about how LGBTQ+ interacts with aging as well, what that means for the workplace, what it's like to look at age and ethnicity as well. We know that there are big pay gaps and inequalities in work in terms of particularly older BAME people as well. So it is one of those ones that interacts with many things. I don't know, Anna, anything else to add from your side?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And in terms of research, I think there's a really interesting experimental study where they basically sent sort of CVs to potential sort of employers, and the only things they changed was sort of age and then ethnicity, and basically it was very clear that, you know, if you were older, I think, you know, you were half as likely to be interviewed, but if you were black and older, you know, you were even less likely. So these things are multiplier effects, and so we know there is, you know, race discrimination, and we know there's age discrimination. So it's perhaps not surprising to see that where they intersect, you know, that is a multiplier effect, and people are really adversely affected. So I think we need to understand much more about how those intersectionalities operate, but certainly it is a concern in that particular area that people are facing additional discrimination in terms of age and race.
Great, thank you. There's a great comment in the, I think rather than a question, from Pegs Field and Bays about her experience of being recruited in Braze, which I have to say, Pegs, has cheered me up no end to show that it can be done properly, although you make the very good point that you learned about the opportunity from your daughter, which does suggest that Bays needs to widen its channels of communication, which I know it's looking at for ethnic minority and social mobility reasons, but I think we need to speak to the recruitment team to focus on age, and we use Textio, which I think helps to a degree in some of the wording, but I think how we can improve general job descriptions, particularly internal job descriptions, better to encourage people. one of the issues you covered, Anna, was about setting an age-positive environment. Do you have any good case examples or lessons for us in terms of how to persuade the management board, the top of the office, to prioritise this? Because a lot of the examples I've seen from Aviva or Homebase and others, there's a direct commercial benefit, as you hinted at, by having people in the workforce similar to your target market. I guess our target market is largely politicians, so you could argue there was a problem there. But any tips as to what I and Jane and the network can use as our tools to persuade colleagues to continue to prioritise this?
Yeah, well, I think there's plenty of evidence to bust some of the myths, about older workers are more likely to go off sick. No, they're not. Older workers are less likely to stick around. No, they're not. They're often very loyal. You can get quite long service out of an older worker. In terms of some of the myths about skills and aptitude, most of those have been shown to not be held up in terms of studies. So I think there's quite a lot to sort of get rid of some of the myth busting. But then in terms of the positive case, I mean, I hope that most leaders now across the civil service will understand the diversity case, that if you've got a diverse team, and I mean diversity by any characteristic, that is often going to bring different experiences, different ways of thinking. And particularly when you're trying to solve complex problems, as many of you are in the civil service, and come up with policies that are going to actually work in practice, in terms of how they're going to have an impact, understanding the breadth of the population and being able to think yourselves into the minds of potentially some of the organisations that would have to implement these policies, or some of the people who ultimately those policies are designed to impact on their lives. Having that diversity that represents the population within your teams is going to make you a more successful team. And I do think, even you're saying that some of this is the evidence about productivity is coming from private sector teams. I do think that there is some transference. So if you've got some older workers within a team, that team performance can often be better, and there seem to be some spillover effects from the experience that an older worker can bring to those teams. Does make a difference to the overall performance of the team. So, it'd be great, wouldn't it, if we could do some studies in the civil service to widen that evidence base on the productivity in a different sector. It's obviously very different from McDonald's and how many burgers get flipped and customer satisfaction. But I think there's enough good and transferable evidence from the sort of benefits of diverse teams more generally that I think would suggest that age diverse teams is also going to bring positive benefits. So I think we probably need to keep making the case. And obviously, sometimes leaders don't like to take examples from other sectors and want to know, will it work for us? But as I say, I think there is growing evidence that can make a pretty convincing case about why the performance of teams is better if they are diverse, and specifically age diverse.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we certainly get the and we certainly got a good reaction from our ExCo to the general economic arguments, and obviously the politicians are very keen that the civil service reflects the population we serve, because we will get better policy as a result. But that's kind of generic, and it's why now is the kind of thing that we need to keep pushing as the main difference. I
mean, obviously we very much, and we made this in the context of the industrial strategy, that obviously the wider economic benefit of closing the economic activity gap. So I was there trying to make a case for why the civil service, might see a case for itself being age diverse. But, in terms of BEIS's policy, and indeed, hopefully an interest for government as a whole, that economic activity gap that I started with, you know, is a huge loss. It's a loss, obviously, to the people who are not in work, but it's a huge loss to the economy. Not only are those people not working and therefore not earning and not paying taxes, it's actually reducing their consumer spend because they're going to be poorer, and it's potentially increasing the welfare bill, well, quite considerably. We've seen with the rise in women's state pension age, yes, there has been a positive pull factor with more women working, but there's also been a displacement with increases in the number of people in those years before state pension age on employment support allowance. So, you know, this, in terms of an economic imperative to close that economic activity gap, I think the case is very strong, and I really hope that government as a whole, you know, will recommit to that. It was a very strong commitment in the industrial strategy, and obviously all of the fuller working lives strategy previously, but it would be great to see a renewed commitment to recognise, as we come out of COVID, the importance of getting older workers back into work because of the wider economic benefits.
Yes, well, the plan for growth was published alongside the budget today. I haven't read it yet, but we need to do a word search for age and see whether they've got that properly referenced. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat, so I think we should probably draw to an end. I think, well, first of all, thanks very much to Anna and Patrick for that really insightful presentation. I think if we may come back to you with ideas on kind of what research projects we might be able to do with the civil service, because I'm very keen that we do try and get a bit more publicity into the good things that the civil service are doing, but also how we could improve better and do more, and research on the impacts of different initiatives I think would help with that. And we're talking to the central civil service HR team about that. We will all now consume your website and the key points in it. But thank you both for your time. We'll circulate the slides to those who attended. It will probably be in SharePoint, so maybe limited to BAYS only. But most of this material is on your website, isn't it, Anna? Yes,
definitely. So if people want to find out more, they can go to www.aging-better.org.uk. And all of our resources, both the practical guides and the underpinning research, are all there. And if you want to keep updated, you know, we have some great blogs and guest blogs from people writing about some of these issues on employment. So do sign up for our newsletter, and we'll keep you in touch, as well as inviting you to webinars and various things that we do. So yes, it's all there, and we would be really delighted. We obviously, as I mentioned, are going into a very practical phase next with our age bias in recruitment. So we actually want to work with employers and recruiters to see how we can take the insights that we've gathered through the research and actually show in practice how you can further debias the recruitment process. So I'm sure Patrick will be knocking on doors to see if there's opportunities for collaboration. But you know, it's been great, and obviously your leadership, Neil, you know, that is part of it, is having visible leadership within organisations championing this. So thank you for that, and you know, continuing to sort of make this a priority for BAYS.
Well, if I thank you, Anna, and I think if I may come back to you. There is a cross Whitehall group of age champions, so I'll see if I can try and get you involved in some of the civil service recruitment to kind of measure whether we're doing the right thing. But that's an ambition, I'm afraid, rather than a promise, and I'll see what we can do. But thanks everyone for listening, and we'll circulate the slides in due course. But have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.